Hey, today you're going to learn about telling stories through photos, about photographic style, whether it's actually good to have one, about creating a sense of mood in your photos, and a whole lot of other things too. Ask yourself, what does each photo show? How might it make the viewers feel? Judging by your work, I think that you do have your voice and your vision. You seem to be the kind of person that takes their camera with them almost everywhere, so you're able to capture the serendipity of life. So the first person for today is David Esteban from Argentina. Here is David's website, and this is his Instagram. David's email is a pretty long one, so I'm just gonna summarize it. He starts with saying, "I'm really happy you are giving us this opportunity. David reminds me that last year I gave him and his students in Rwanda free access to my travel photography course. He says that the photos he's sharing were taken after or while watching the course. Now, I am giving away free access to all of the participants of these photo critiques, and just to let you know that due to this global crisis, my travel photography course is currently on the biggest discount ever, 70% off. So if you'll enjoy this video, the same style of teaching is in this course, plus there's obviously much more in it." David feels that his photography has improved a lot. He doesn't mind feedback on composition, lighting, and that sort of stuff, but what he really wants to know is if he's telling a cohesive story with his photos as a whole. Once the lockdown is over, David wants to do more projects on the topics that he cares about, and he wants to tell more stories through his photos. A little bit about this school where David worked and lived for 7 months. It's a school/village which aims to provide a safe environment for vulnerable youth. More specifically, for children who belong to the Tutsi ethnic group, who were left orphaned during the horrific genocide that took place in Rwanda in the 90s. Okay, so I'm going to go through this photo story in detail, and I'm going to pay special attention to those photos which I don't think have any particular purpose within the bigger story, and to the photos which I think have a particularly strong purpose and really add to the bigger story. And the photos which are just sort of okay, I'll go through them pretty quickly. I hope that the way I talk about the photos will give you an idea of how you should look at them, of the sorts of things that you should be thinking when putting together a photo story. So firstly, these two photographs here. I don't quite get the compositional choices. They're both shot with a long lens, there's this play with the depth of field, but I don't exactly understand why. Are you making them from far away because these people are very important and that's the only shot that you could get of them? Or maybe it's some sort of a dance or an activity, but I don't see enough information to understand that. So because we don't really know what's happening, these images really don't say much or add to the story. Moving down, I understand, yes, this shows you how beautiful the setting of the school is. It kind of works, and the same with this photo here, but I think that the images further down are much more impactful and tell us a more or less similar thing, but more effectively. So these three photos right here, they all show essentially the same thing. I think they're a stronger representation of the location, and there are people, or there are things happening. If I have to choose one image, I would choose this one. It tells us more. The same lake, the same hills in the distance, but there's also the youth playing football and all these young people relaxing outdoors. So there's just more information in the one frame. I love these two photos, and I think they work very well next to each other, like they are on your website, or if it were a magazine or a book, they'd work very well together too. I love the emotion here, the body language, these great big smiles. The children are obviously very happy. They're taking part in a group activity, probably building bonds, being competitive. Really great illustration of what this school is about. If I were to choose only one, I'd probably choose this one. Again, just because there's more happening, more information in one frame. These two photos, I think they work very good together as well. On one side, the young men are playing football. On the other side, the crowd is cheering. So pretty solid, pretty straightforward. These couple of photos, they don't necessarily make sense to me. Why the choice for black and white? It sort of breaks up the consistency. You did also mention in your email that you chose images which were aesthetically pleasing to you. And I kinda understand your choice here, but what's happening in this photo? What's the purpose? Are they looking out the window at this boy practicing karate or martial arts of some sort? This one I do understand why you'd include it. It shows you the variety of activities that take place at the school, so it works. Again, I just don't necessarily agree with it being black and white when the majority of the images are color. I absolutely love this portrait. I think the positivity that it emits, these really happy faces, really comfortable in front of the camera. It's a very simple photograph, but the expressions are so genuine. It seems that they're really enjoying being photographed too. I think that if you want to tell a story of positivity, of something amazing happening in this school/village, and this photo represents it very well. Really like this photo. There's definitely a story here. A tired child, maybe after a field trip, just fell asleep on the teacher's or the caretaker's lap. Works very well as part of a bigger whole. Again, why black and white here? No clue about what's happening here. There's nothing below it or to the side that gives me any hint. I wouldn't necessarily include this one. This photo. Yeah, I think it works for a specific purpose. If it's some sort of a delegation, a group of doctors, volunteers, I don't know who they are, but we get a sense of the place. You could include it if it's for a report book or something like that. This beautiful sunset over a hill. This could be absolutely anywhere in the world, so I don't think it adds much to your story. Now some images where I think the sense of story is getting really strong and which work really well as a part of a whole. The first photograph, not so much, but we do get a sense of maybe what these youth are learning or just the sorts of activities that are taking place. Another image that works, I think, these young men looking at the computer screen, learning, monitoring something maybe. Don't know, but it's clear that they're doing something with technology, so we see that this is a place of learning and technology. This image is strong. Couldn't be more clear that we're in a school where learning is taking place, a blackboard with some school material, there's interaction between the teacher and the student. The only thing that I have a slight problem with is this desk, which is sort of distracting, but it doesn't take away enough from the image. This is a really nice photograph. We see enough to understand that it's set in the cafeteria. This boy looking very attentively at the young woman. Maybe she's a visitor, a volunteer, a teacher. I don't know who she is, but she obviously has a very caring look in her eyes. Seems like there's a very pleasant interaction between the two. So a really nice moment that adds another dimension to the story. It shows that there's this interaction between the children at the school and someone who seems to be from a different world. Very solid, pretty self-explanatory here. A dentist at work. Some sort of administration taking place, I guess. Yeah, this works. It's not a star photo, and I don't know just how important this part is to your overall story, but it shows that this is a relatively modern and functional place with computers. I'd include something like this if you're sending the images to an editor so that they can have more choice. This image confuses me. I don't know who this man is. What's the purpose for photographing him from below, looking up at him? Is he somebody important? Is he some sort of a boss? If he is, I would rather have seen him in a more formal setting, maybe looking at the camera. Right now, it's a candid portrait, but in the larger scheme of things, I don't exactly know what the reason to make this portrait candid is. Ask yourself, what does this photo add to the story of the village, of the school? I think this is a very strong image of dentists at work. Again, straightforward and self-explanatory. Works really well. I'd definitely keep this one. Here, I'm not exactly sure if this boy is bored or if he's concentrating. but you just have better photographs of children in school than these boys at the back of the room. I like this one. It seems like here they're singing, they're doing something. This boy's clapping, you have a blackboard in the back, so you understand that it's a school environment. This one tells me much more than the image there. And I really like this photograph. I think this is very strong. You can see the medical staff attending the patients. You can see that there are quite few of them. So a great illustrational kind of shot. Definitely adds to the story. Children going back to school, I suppose. This is okay. It makes sense to include something like this. I just wish that you had a stronger photograph of something similar. More children clapping, it's kind of nice. I think it would have been nicer if maybe the hand didn't block out so much of the frame. I would only choose one of these shots, either this one or this one above. Another photograph in the classroom. I'd probably prefer something either over the shoulder or to see more of the faces. Not a big fan of this one. If you had no similar photos, okay, you could use this, but I think that the other ones are stronger. This photo, what does this add? Perhaps the kids are going on their break, but this is an image which, when you look at the other photographs, doesn't add much extra. Perhaps it would if there were smiles or laughs. Another similar one. I think that you really just have to choose one or two images of the children in front of the blackboard. You can pick whichever one you like best. Now here, we have these two really beautiful photographs, and I don't quite know what's happening. I guess this is a religious celebration of some sort. Why only two photos? And why these two? There are many very similar photos from the classroom, and some of them are not even that visually strong. And then we have this couple of visually strong images, and that's it, no more. I would like to see some supporting, explanatory types of photographs of what's happening. I don't exactly know what's going on, and I want to know. And there is David with the students, looking crazy in this shot, and it seems like you all had a lot of fun. So, David, overall, there is no doubt that there is a strong sense of story going through your photographs. They do work as a whole, as a story. In fact, the very first time that I saw these images, I did get a very good idea of what's happening in this place. And you don't even have any captions, so this is a very good sign. I think your main issue is that you've probably included too many photographs. You can communicate the same message, the same story, with less. If this is a submission to an editor, then okay, it's fine to have more images. You want to give them more choice. In that case, it's also okay to have similar images. But if this is a final product of sorts, a final presentation, then I would definitely cut the number of images down from, you currently have 37, I'd cut it down to about 10, 15. Also, I feel like having a few very similar images can lessen their impact. When you see similar photos, one of which isn't that good, another sort of halfway there, and one of them is really good, you can kind of become desensitized to the photo that's actually really good and strong. Before I finish up, David sent me another series of photos to have a look at as well. I'm quickly showing you these images. No time to discuss them in depth, but I think in general the things that I just mentioned apply here as well. David, think about what's really critical to the story that you want to tell. I think that would be images like this one, maybe some of the wildlife, some of the landscapes, the setting. But then stuff like this, what does it really add? Two types of similar images and neither one of them is particularly strong? Is this something crucial? Even if it is, one of these images is enough. So try not to repeat the same thing through your photographs. And I really want you to think about why exactly is it that every now and then you include a random black and white image in a mostly color photo story. So, David, thank you very much for submitting your photographs. I'm really glad that you found my travel photography course useful, and I'm really happy that the students enjoyed it too. I think that you're definitely 100% on the right track. You know, I can't tell what you maybe missed out on because I wasn't there with you, but from what I see, if anything, you have more images than needed. In my opinion, you just need to select less and to just really think about the purpose of each photograph. Ask yourself, what does each photo show? How might it make the viewers feel? And what does each photo add to the overall story or the feel of what you're trying to communicate? If the answer is not much or nothing, then get rid of it and remember the old saying that sometimes less is actually more. The next group of photos is from Tatiana Nadiseva. She lives in Germany, but she's from St. Petersburg, Russia. This is her Instagram, and this is her website. So, to Tatiana's email. I would love to understand how I can grow as a photographer, and feeling a bit stuck as of now. I have no clue of what is exactly my personal style and if what I do is any good. Where do I need to focus more? Technical details perhaps? Have different equipment? Something else? How can I develop? Do I have potential? What am I best at? What is lacking? Okay, I want to address this idea of style. I look at style in two different ways. The first is defined by the people in power in the photo industry. So, photo editors, art directors, creative directors, etc. They want to know what they can expect from a photographer. For their work, they need a certain level of predictability. A lot of photographers have bought into this idea and they work hard to attain style in this sense. But I would argue that this idea of style and the idea of growth as a photographer are actually two contradictory things. Style in this sense puts you into a box and it limits you in the way that you make your photographs. From a commercial standpoint, this makes a lot of sense. You become known for something, people hire you, great, but you can very easily get stuck in that style forever. Tatiana, looking at your photos, I'm not sure that you're making them for commercial purposes. Seems to me like you make them for your soul, primarily. I get the impression that for you, photography is almost meditative. So I wouldn't worry too much about style in this sense. There is another definition of style. It's more like your personal voice, your vision. Style in this sense is more flexible. It develops, it evolves over time, it can change, and I like this idea of style much more. Judging by your work, I think that you do have your voice and your vision. I'd say that a big part of your style is your fascination, your love for the quite magical moments of life, and you photograph them everywhere. I honestly love this kind of work, and I do love that it's quite personal. I'll just go through the images which I particularly like from this portfolio on the front page. So this one here, on the horse from your perspective. It's all about your personal view, the experience of being on a horse, and the serenity of the nature around you. It's your special moment. This wonderful, magical photograph of the sea. Very simple, perhaps not everybody has the sensitivity to appreciate it. This is a perfect example of the kind of photograph that's like a poem. In fact, a lot of your images are like visual poems. I really love these two photos of a woman in the water. I pretty much like all your photos related to the water. This person just floating. I have no idea what's happening, and it's fine. It's open to interpretation. It's a question. It's evocative. These photos with the birds I find quite magical. I can almost hear the seagulls squawking. And this is one of my favorite examples of the birds. Again, the simplicity. It's almost banal. Not something most would care to photograph. Birds flying in their large flocks over crops, making a lot of noise, then they gradually disappear, as does the noise. Many of us have seen something similar in Europe, but you had the sensitivity, the sensibility to capture it. And for anybody sensitive enough to have remembered such a scene, to have imprinted it, this photo will instantly set off triggers in their mind. I can almost hear these birds right now. I can smell the soil, the grass, the cool air. this image. A foggy day, an old house, a naked tree, and you have this anchor. So is this a house of a seaman? A fisherman? Is the anchor here because there's no going out to sea at the moment? Or does anyone here go out to sea at all anymore? Questions. My imagination is working. A simple but quietly beautiful and magical scene. And you're leaving what I refer to as visual cues. The leafless tree branches, the fog, the cool, mostly grey colour palette. If this is in Europe, which I think it is, there are signs that winter is approaching. If you're in a warmer part, maybe it's already winter. This photo of the woman kind of reaching out into the landscape. You keep posing questions. There are mysteries. You're creating photos which can be interpreted in different ways. Some might say, well, these photos make no sense, but that depends on how you look at them. You can create all the sense in them that you want. It's up to the viewer. When I look at some of these, it's almost like I've been transported into these scenes. I'm there. I don't know what's happening, but I get a very strong sense of the place, the mood, and whatever is happening at the moment. I suggested to Ferdinando, one of the participants from the last video, to create more photos which are like poems. And in Tatiana's case, most of her photographs are like poems, with no clear narrative. Rather, there are meanings flexible to our interpretation. However, I do feel, Tatiana, like you are kind of falling into the trap of style in a commercial sense too, even if your intentions are not commercial. It's most evident in your post-processing. All of these photographs, they're post-processed in a very similar sort of way. Subdued colors, somewhat desaturated, soft contrasts. Even in your series from Morocco, I'm also seeing that. I mean, I remember how colorful Morocco was, but you show it as more subdued, less overwhelming with the colors. In and of itself, this decision is fine. But do you want to keep the same color palette regardless of where you travel to? Regardless of what colors the world and life present to you? This sort of stuff is really highly subjective. I think what you're doing is beautiful, wonderful, but since you are asking about growth, then I think that one of the factors that stops us from growing is if we're limiting ourselves. And I am going to talk about this a little later on. For now, I just want to go back to some of your questions. So I think the question about style, I've answered that. The next question. Is what you do any good? I think it's very good. It's distinct. It's yours. It's personal. And when you ask stuff like, do I need to focus more on technical details perhaps, or to have different equipment? I don't think that you need to focus on anything technical. Technically, the images are great. About the equipment, I feel that you are getting the most out of your equipment for what you are currently doing. Now, I don't know, maybe you want to do other kinds of work and your equipment is hindering you, only you know that. But in general, I would say that the equipment is not the first place to look when you want to grow as a photographer. You also ask, what are you best at? You're best at capturing the quietly magical moments, making your photographs very personal, going to places where maybe people expect one kind of photo, but you show them something quite different. Goes back to your very personal touch, a distinct vision of what's interesting to you. Or maybe you're following your instincts and through your images you're communicating what you feel. That's totally valid and you can keep developing that. But now to the question, how can you grow? How can you develop? And of course, growth and development are quite subjective. I could say, look, what you're doing is absolutely fine. You've already found your voice, you have a distinct vision, and you even have your post-processing style. However, in my opinion, growth happens when you step away from what you are familiar with. It doesn't need to happen suddenly. It could be happening very subtly right now. I think that's kind of the case with me. Very subtly and organically, certain things come to me, my vision changes very slowly, and as a result, my photography changes too. I'm just going to bring up your Morocco images again. As I said, they are still kind of processed in the same way, and in them you are still looking almost purely for these quite magical moments. So I think one way to develop would be to challenge yourself not to only look for those quite magical moments. I don't know if you have any interest in that, but that is one way to do it, to get out of your comfort zone. How? I think one obvious way is to start photographing people more, or to start photographing them differently to how you've been photographing them up until now. Right now, so many have their backs turned. Maybe that's a stylistic decision again, but in that case, again, it's very limiting. I know that it is difficult to photograph people in parts of Morocco, especially in Essaouira, where a lot of these photos are taken, but you know, that's part of the challenge. Or if it's not Morocco, wherever else you are, try making portraits. As I look through your Instagram, I see some wonderful portraits, made with your sensitivity, with your attention to detail, to moments. This is wonderful. I just love this shot of, I'm guessing it's a self-portrait. This is pure magic here. I get the impression that the people you photograph from close up are your friends or they're people you know. This is your grandmother. Maybe this is a friend. There are occasional photos of strangers where we can see their faces, but you don't get close to them, or you photograph them from behind. We don't get to look into their eyes to study their faces. So that is the challenge that I would set for myself if I were you, to try to photograph strangers in a more intimate way, like you photograph the people that you know. Now, it will not be easy, that is for sure, but if you can manage it, that would be absolutely huge for your growth. I would much rather more of these kinds of photos than a bunch of people with their backs turned. You don't need to completely change the type of photography that you do, but imagine you start mixing it up. Imagine that you take your ability, this gift that you have to turn the everyday quiet scenes into something magical, and you combine that with portraits. So when I look at something like this house with the anchor outside, well, who lives inside the house? And let's just say it's some great old bearded fisherman. I don't know, of course, but let's imagine that. Seeing the photograph of the house on one side and the portrait of our imaginary bearded fisherman on the other side, well, how much impact would that have? You'd still have the quiet magic of the everyday life, but you'd also have a human presence, a stronger sense of story, and a deeper way to relate to the scene. Then, of course, there's the post-processing. I really like, in fact, I love the way that you post-process some of your images. But is this something that's now kind of becoming a trademark? Like I said, a style in that commercial sense? There's a very thin line between something being your trademark and something that's limiting you. Try to process your photographs completely differently every now and then. At the moment, it's like I said, all very soft, partly desaturated. The impression that I have is that you're photographing a lot in the fog, sort of during the later hours of sunset, when the sun has already gone down, or some of the images that are taken in a sort of a harsh light, perhaps the midday hours. Again, you kind of soften them. You apply a very particular style to them. So stylistically, in terms of post-processing, I would experiment with shadows. Try to create images that are much more contrasty, that have much deeper levels of blacks in them. Play around much more with shadow and light, both when you're photographing and in post-processing. I feel that you are kind of heading in that direction with some of your Morocco photographs, but I'd really love to see more of that. Just going through these motions, trying these things, it'll teach you a lot, and it may very well help you see differently. You may realize that certain photos you might not have considered before actually have a lot of photographic potential. Going back to the question of what do I lack? It's this, the experimentation. Completely going away from what you're comfortable with and venturing into the unfamiliar territory photographically. Now, finally, I want to really quickly address this other question you're asking. Do I have potential? I don't know who you've shown your photographs to or who has told you what about your photography. I think that one of the most common issues for creative people is that we often lack confidence. We're unsure of ourselves, our art, craft. I totally know what you mean when you're asking this, because I was in exactly the same situation at one stage of my photographic journey. I'll share a quick story to demonstrate that sometimes we need somebody to give us some encouragement, or a push. I hope that I can give you some of that encouragement, as someone did quite a long time ago for me. I was in Nepal and I met this photographer. He had come to Nepal on a motorcycle from Moscow. He was much more experienced than me, had shot for many of the famous newspapers. He was in the middle of a project for National Geographic when we met. And there I was, 25 years old, pretty clueless and not really knowing whether I was actually a photographer. So this guy, he was a real cynical bastard. When I told him that I'm a travel photographer, he said, "Oh, so you shoot puppies and flowers, that's very sweet." But then one day he said, "Why don't you show me some of your favorite photos from this trip?" And I did. He took a look at them and he said, "Congratulations, young man, you're a photographer." And this, coming from him, really meant a lot to me. I had already understood that he didn't consider every kind of photography worthwhile. He used to have this theory that all that people care about are love and war. And he had photographed a few wars. But he saw something in my photos. He gave me a whole lot of advice. Some of it has stayed with me till today. The most important thing, though, is that he helped me believe that I was, in fact, a photographer. So looking at all your photos, I think you really have a lot to offer. You're definitely a photographer. You have great potential, and I think that you can actually do much more. Some of your photos are already really powerful. I can only imagine how many more powerful photos you could create once you step out of your comfort zone, once you push yourself towards exploring your own potential, once you get rid of your own boundaries. So, Tatiana, thank you very much for submitting your work. The last portfolio for this episode is from Amadeusz from Poland. He sent me his Instagram link, and this is it. I've got to say right away that I love Amadeusz's work. One of my favorite portfolios also from all of the submissions. Now let's get to his email. Hi Mitchell, I appreciate your work and courses that you did. Thank you. I have a pretty straightforward way of looking at scenes, and I would like you to concentrate on the perspective of my photos. How am I showing the subjects and how it corresponds with storytelling and creating mood? I'm not too sensitive, so if you have any other complaints, go ahead. I don't complain in these videos, but I will give you some of my thoughts for sure. This idea of having a pretty straightforward way of seeing scenes, I kind of agree with you, but there is something important to be said here too. Yes, you do create photos that are accessible, straightforward, and understandable, but I think that far from everybody can actually see the things that you see and kind of convert them into photos so effectively. I will have a couple of suggestions for you about the perspective, about the mood, but first, for educational purposes, I want to go through some of your work and discuss what's great about it, because I think there's a lot to learn here. So just going through Amadeusz's photos, I feel that we're very much on the same wavelength as far as travel and photography. I think that a big part of travel photography is dependent on how you actually travel and, to an extent, on what places you travel to. If you're an independent, off-the-beaten-track kind of traveler, that will open you up to different kinds of photo opportunities that other people won't get. From your images and the places you go to, I get the sense that you are an intrepid traveler. So I love the spirit of that. Maybe it is because it's on the same wavelength as me, right up my alley, as they say. It doesn't matter. Now, about your work and this idea of storytelling, of how you see the scenes. One of the things that I notice is that many of your images, they tell stories, even quite complex stories, in one frame. I love how you find these characters and how you find these moments. These ingredients are wonderful for a visual story. One of the things I really appreciate about your work is that you never seem to be chasing that postcard image. I've mentioned in the past episode that there's nothing necessarily wrong with chasing that postcard image, but I find it much more interesting when there's a story, when there are different levels to the story. And I think that the experience of looking for something that's your own, not just trying to replicate the great photos that you've seen before, this is generally so much more rewarding for the photographer. It seems, Amadeusz, that for you, travel and photography are about the experiences, the moments, the little slices of life, and of course, the stories. You're right there in the world that you're photographing, amidst the people. You're not in a bubble on a package tour of some sort. You're on public buses with very regular people. And I really love this. Post-USSR babushka, one of the toughest species on our planet. I can attest to this from my own grandmothers, both very, very tough, lived through the war, funny but true caption. Even with your landscapes, you don't look to glamorize them, to only make them look really stunning. I feel like your photos tell stories about the landscapes. Like this one, a dramatically beautiful kind of sun-bleached landscape, but this photo is as much about the very bad road going through the landscape. Something like this, it is a bit more about the beauty, and you do have landscape photos which are primarily about beauty, but in some cases you accompany a beautiful landscape with a landscape that tells a story, which shows just how desolate these places are, with some sort of shelter by a road which just seems to be going into nowhere for hundreds of kilometers, most likely. So far, it is true, these are pretty straightforward representations of the world, but they work so well. And I will be touching on the non-straightforward representations a little later on. For now, I just want to point out some other things that I like about your work and about your approach to photography. Another thing that I think is really important about your approach to work. At least this is the impression that I get. You seem to be the kind of person that takes their camera with them almost everywhere. So you're able to capture the serendipity of life. So many real, raw moments, unposed, unfiltered. I think that in this lies a big part of the magic of photography. You know, one thing is to have one of these photo shoots and to have a person pose in a certain way, stand in a certain place, under a certain kind of light, and a totally different thing is just really seeing life as it is, recording the reality of life, which is often so much more beautiful and so much more fascinating than anything that we can construct ourselves. It could be a little moment like this, a gesture, and sometimes it's fairly obvious that this moment might be photogenic, but other times it's far from obvious. I mean, you had to have your camera here, and then you had to recognize the color harmony in the scene, the geometry, the woman framed by the square window, the repetition of the two loaves of bread. I don't know if this is something spontaneous or something you asked her to do, since you shot a little story on her. But the fact is, you have your camera with you and you had the presence of mind to create a very simple but a very effective portrait like this one. You need to have an ability to notice stuff like this. I think that this is a big thing that one can't underestimate, underappreciate. Now, in your email, you do ask about creating a mood. And look, mood is not something that jumps out at me first when I look at your body of work as a whole. But maybe that's just because the sense of story is so strong. Mood is in large part about the light, and the color palette plays a part in this too. And from most photographs of yours, or the ones that really strike me, it feels to me like you are prioritizing just capturing the moment and telling the stories. Tatiana's photos, which I talked about just before yours, they're all about the mood. It's the light that she shoots and it's the absence of a dominant narrative. Of course, you do have some photos where the sense of mood is very strong, and I'm just going to go over some of those. Here, the light plays a really strong role in conveying a certain mood. The sun going down, the colors changing, and everything kind of becoming mysterious. Obviously something like this as well. I keep coming back to this idea of visual cues because they do play a very important role in setting or creating a mood. If you have a dark scene lit by a candle, people will often say that, oh, that was a really romantic mood, or it was very atmospheric, mysterious, cozy. So you get a very strong sense of mood in photographs like this. If you have raindrops on a window, yeah, we feel like it's grey and raining and kind of unpleasant. Not to say that your photos with a strong sense of story don't have some sense of mood. It's just that the stories, the gestures, the body language, moments are so strong that I'm kind of thinking about those before I sense any mood. And this could be just a personal thing, subjective to me, but maybe worth thinking about. This image of the remote mountain village in Iran, perhaps at dusk. This is mood. These meadows as well. The Armenian mountains on the Iranian border. The sense of mood dominates in images like these. In other images, the sense of story dominates. And then you have something like this, which I think has a strong sense of both. Because you have the atmosphere of being in a totally desolate place, drought-stricken, very bright, bleached colors. Then you have the story. This man praying in what seems to essentially be the middle of nowhere. Here, this is much more about the mood again, because we don't have that many details for the story. So I feel this scene before I read any story into it. This image is somewhere in between a little roadside eatery or a shop, and it's getting dark. Evocative dark colors and the bright warm colors of the artificial lights. And you have a few more photos which I'd say are about the mood too, but I'll just go to this one, which is a self-portrait. You really played around with the light here. This, to me, again, is where the mood is felt very strongly. The shadows, I don't know if they're from the street lights or what, but the interplay of light is such a strong trigger that it almost never leaves the viewer's senses indifferent. Okay, I've said it a few times already, I love your work, but let's get to the question of how you could maybe improve. And honestly, I don't think that you need to change anything about your photography, and the suggestions I'm gonna make, they may just come to you naturally, but for the purposes of this video, for educational purposes, I will say a few things anyway. Now, first, as an exercise, if nothing more, I would try to create some longer photo stories. You already have a few little sequences on your Instagram, but I would refer to them as sort of micro stories. They're essentially on just short topics. A woman baking bread, a ceremony, that's fine, but can you create something around that? Maybe something about the lives of the participants leading up to the ceremony. What do they do outside the ceremony? Same with the woman baking bread. What else does she do? Or maybe include other bread bakers or the people in the fields. Another thing that you can try is to create a larger story of your whole trip or a part of your trip. Whether it's for a blog post or a magazine, whatever you want, that's up to you. You clearly already have a real gift for storytelling. I'm sure that you would be able to create something like that, but why not challenge yourself? That's kind of the next logical challenge, to create a larger photo story. Can you create a whole book of your trip and be happy with how your trip is represented with a whole collection of photos that are of the same quality that I see throughout your Instagram feed? Now, about this idea of seeing the scenes in a pretty straightforward kind of way. As I think I've made pretty clear, I don't see anything wrong with it, but if you want to challenge yourself, then why not play around with the framing, with the perspective? Let's say something like this. A very obvious but beautiful photo. But what if you only framed this boy's hand over this boy's head or his shoulder, and still framed the mountains in the background? Or a photo like this, which is fairly wide. I love it, but again, to challenge yourself. Why not shoot with a larger lens and only focus on the kiss or on the women's expressions? Then you're kind of telling the same story, but in a more minimalist way, because you're showing less. But at the same time, it's deeper. You're getting much closer, showing the eyes, the expressions, the emotions. So as a result, people are reading that photograph in a completely different way. This woman in red. Is it important to frame the whole woman? Or could you maybe only show us the red dress and her blonde hair? Or the red dress and her high heels? I don't know if she actually has high heels, or if you could still include this stop sign, which kind of mirrors the red pretty nicely, but it is something to think about, a direction that you could go into. Same idea with this man praying. This is a wonderful image. Why not add to it and experiment with only showing a close-up of the face and the hands in the praying position? By getting in closer, by cutting out much of the scene, you'd be leaving some ambiguity in your photographs. I talked about this in the first episode. What this could do is engage the viewer's imagination a little bit more. At the moment, you're showing me, you're telling me everything. But what if you only show me a detail and let me imagine the rest? I don't think that you should necessarily go completely in that direction, but if you mix things up a little, I feel that your work would just get ridiculously strong. One of my favorite photographers that I suggest looking at is Georgy Pinchasov. I'm just showing you some of his works that come to mind. I think that you could find a lot of inspiration in his images. Some of his earlier works were much more literal, and then later on some people might say that he's kind of gone overboard, but some of the stuff halfway I think is absolutely genius, and he does exactly what I've just been mentioning. Shows just enough to engage the viewer's imagination, and at the same time creates a very strong sense of story, and sometimes with the light, a strong sense of mood as well. Now, I will repeat, nothing wrong with your work. I'm mentioning these things because these are critiques. Your work right now reminds me somewhat of a Russian photographer called Sergei Maximishin, and here are some of his photos. His photography is all about moments, entire stories in one frame, very strong. I think he created the vast part of his body of work in the 90s, maybe early 2000s, and he quickly kind of rose to fame in certain circles. Had a lot of work published in Geo, and I think his photos are absolutely wonderful. He's just kept creating this sort of classical reportage type photographs that tell us a whole lot. So you could continue what you're doing and you'll probably end up with a similar body of work. Or you could challenge yourself creatively and see where that takes you. Because that's the thing, it might not take you anywhere, but it might also take you someplace really amazing creatively. And of course, you never know, unless you actually try. Well, that's it. Once again, just loved looking at these photos. Thank you very much, Amadeusz, for submitting your work. I hope that once this insane crisis ends, you'll continue traveling, continue exploring, and that you'll keep your camera with you at all times so that you can continue to share these great photographs and stories with us. So that is it for episode number 2. Thank you very much for watching. Subscribe, hit the bell to be notified when the next episode is out, which should be sometime next week. And until then, goodbye.